Hi, it's Mike Stevenson here. Today in the video we're going to talk about Logic App Standard and how to use the cloud connections and handle the DevOps challenges that you need to go through to get that all kind of working quite well. So if we think about what is a cloud connector to begin with. So here we've got our Logic app on the screen, and let me just make my pen a bit smaller. So we've got our Logic app on the screen. So we've got two kinds of connectors here. So with standard Logic apps, we can use a built-in connector. So we've got a built-in connector which leverages the Azure function bindings, and that supports a number of different types of connections. So things like storage, service bus, etc. There is the other kind of connector where you would deploy a resource in Azure, which usually gets called an API connection. And really what that's doing is it's providing an API that the Logic app can call, and then behind the connector there's some kind of, maybe there's like a Swagger behind the scenes talking to an end system, or there's some kind of code running somewhere that you would call from your Logic app via this API connection, and then it executes whatever you need for the connection to do. So really it's kind of like an API proxy pattern. But the key difference is the built-in connector doesn't deploy a resource on Azure. It's just the code actually initiates the connection from the node the Logic app runs on and talks directly, say in this case, to the storage account. Whereas in the API connection, the Logic app's initiating a call out to this Azure resource here. So behind the scenes, that's going to be an HTTP call. And then this service here forwards it on to whatever you're connecting to. Now, what we're going to do in this demo, I'm going to use an Azure Service Bus queue just for the simplicity of making the demo easy to use. I don't have to deal with any overly complicated end systems, but I'm still with Service Bus. I could use the built-in connector, but for this demo, or this walkthrough, I'm going to use the API connector. So that's the same way you would talk to it from a consumption Logic app to a queue. You can still do the same approach in Logic App Standard. Now, what we're going to do is the process for how you would do this is the bit I want to go through today. So I guess a couple of things are, there's a number of steps you need to sort of handle in your solution that you're going to build. So the first one's going to be creating the connection, that API connection in the cloud. How are you going to handle configuring that and then handle that across the deployment to other environments? You would then have your Logic app created. Now, I'm going to do a bunch of stuff in Terraform. Now, one of the things I'm going to have to do is after I've create my connection, I'm going to need to read the connection to get things like its ID and stuff like that. We're then going to create an RBAC permission. So this is one of the important bits for anybody who's a bit more familiar with Logic apps. There's really, for these API connections, I might have the terminology wrong here, but there's basically a V1 and a V2 behind the scenes, and I think the V1 was consumption and the V2 was standard. So what that or what the subtle difference is in consumption, you were just deploying the API connection as a resource, and it just kind of all sort of hang together between the Logic app and the API connection. But with V2, there needs to be an RBAC permission that comes into play here. So when you call from your Logic app to this API connection, you're going to have some RBAC permissions set on that connection that allows a Logic app to call it. So this would be one of the ways you can have a connection gets used by multiple Logic apps. The RBAC permission, usually you're going to do some kind of managed identity here. So maybe you've got like either a user assigned or a system assigned identity on this Logic app, and then all of the workflows within that Logic app could reuse it. You would also have, in the case of a service bus one here, so I'm going to be using a connection string, so you could flow through an identity through to service bus, but in this case I'm going to use connection string to talk to service bus, but there'll be this RBAC permission controlling the logic app accessing the API connection. Finally, one of the bits we're also going to have to deal with now, I spoke to Wagner about this at Integrate. I'm going to revisit this one after this video at some point with one of my solutions to see if VS Code handles this now. But one of the problems that we had was when you add a connection in VS Code, you've got this key that it gets configured for you to connect to the connection in Azure, because when you're doing it from your dev machine in VS Code, you obviously don't have a managed identity to leverage. So that gives you a little bit of a challenge there. So when you deploy to the app in Azure, it has to be swapped from what they call raw to managed identity. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how we're handling that. But I think the plans the product team had a few months ago was to sort of address that issue, and I'll do a follow-up video when I get a chance to have a look if that's got sorted. But at least people can look at what we did in the meantime. So if we go through the Terraform that I've got, so here is a code snippet from my Terraform, really just showing how I'm setting up my logic app. So you can see here, I've got some of the standard setups for things like my storage account, my plan that the app's running on here. And this is pretty much vanilla logic app setup. I really just want to kind of get across the point that this is how the logic app was set up, and we're going to later on, we're going to talk a little bit about these app settings here that get configured, because there's a little bit of work that comes into play when you're doing the connection relationship to logic app resource. So we'll come back to this in a few slides time, but just be aware that I'm creating my logic app that my code's going to run in from within Terraform. Now the next bit is I can create this connection resource. So this is how I'm going to create my service bus connector. Now here, thing to note is I've got this API, AZ API resource. So there's two types of Terraform providers. So you've got the AZ API, which is basically, it's kind of like a wrapper around the management API, which gives you like an abstraction on making API calls to the management API. So that's how we're going to create this connector. But you also have, I can't remember what the provider's called now, Azure RM, that's the name of it. Actually, there's how you spot the differences. So you can see you've got the Azure RM provider, which is a bit more of like a managed provider. And then you've got the AZ API, which is really like a wrapper on them API calls. Okay, so let's have a look at what we're doing in this connector then. So here I've got my resource type, and then I'm saying it's my connector for service bus. And then on the type, you would specify here what the API is that it's calling. I'm then going to specify here a name for my resource. So here I've just referenced these locals up here where I've created a name for it. So it's an easy way for me to set some parameters for this connector. So I'm going to call it the same name as my logic app, and then put service bus on the end and a small prefix at the front, just as an easy way to identify those. I'm then saying here, I'm just indicating which resource group it lives in, and then I can put some custom tags here if I want to do some tagging. Now, one of the things that I've done here is I've put a deployment time tag with a timestamp on it. Now, if I do that, what that means is every time I run Terraform, it's going to update this resource and update that tag, which kind of is a way of forcing it to refresh. So if ever you change some of the settings, I think one of the things I sort of noticed with this AZ API resource is when you've got these embedded JSON strings here, it doesn't always necessarily notice that something's changed. So sometimes you might have issues like that, but forcing a refresh every time. You can just do a tag update and it'll refresh the whole resource. Now, what I'm doing down here for this API call, I'm really looking at this body section where you can use the JSON encode function here. So I'm just going to shrink my pen slightly further. Right, so you can encode this JSON here. Now what I'm saying is here's the display name for the connector. The API bit is really pointing to, so here I'm specifying my subscription, my providers, and that'll basically point to the type of connector it is. So somewhere at the end here it'll say managed API / service bus. So that'll just be off the end of the screenshot there. And you can see I've got this bit of the type here, so it's a managed API connector. Now the key bit, you really are just telling it what connector you're using here. The key bit that's going to be needed for each of the connections, though, is what are the parameters that you're sending in. So here, when there's a few different articles people have done in the past about how to work out what some of these should be for your DevOps. I think Derek did a good one a few years ago about how to see in Postman what there should be and stuff. For the service bus connector, so the key things I need to do are to indicate what type of authentication I'm doing. And then here I'm just reading from Key Vault. I'm reading a connection string from a Key Vault secret, and I'm just deploying that as the connection string property when the connector runs. So when I run Terraform, this bit here is basically going to build the API connection for connecting to service bus. If I ever wanted to create a different connector, for, say for Dataverse, I'd basically create another resource just like this one, but the key bits that would change would be the API down here would point to the Dataverse connector, and the parameter set here would be the whatever connection details you're using for your Dataverse. So next up, when I come to do the argback bit, one of the things that I'm doing next is I'm creating this data resource here. So what this means, if you notice the keyword for Terraform, here it's saying resource because I'm going to manage and create and update this connector. But what I'm doing here in this one is the data basically means read a resource. So this wraps an API call. It's the same API that I'm calling, which you can see here. And I'm just passing the name for my connector, and I'm just going to export all of its variables. And what I'm going to do here with this depends on is it's going to basically run after the resource has been created, and it's going to read any properties that connector creates. So, for example, there'll be some stuff in my Terraform that the resource wouldn't be aware of that gets done behind the scenes, and I'm just going to read out all of those properties so I can access them later. And if anything changes, I get a refresh on that. So it's really just a way. There might be better ways to do this, to be honest, but this was quite a reliable way I got to read some of those properties for that connector. Now, after that, we then need to do an action for the RBAC piece. So if you notice here, I've got a resource called an API resource action, and I've said after the API connection's been refreshed, add the permission for the Logic Apps managed identity to be able to call this. So here I've got the resource ID, and this is pointing to the property I've just read to get the ID property for my connector. I'm then going to access the access policies, and I'm going to access the access policies and have one named the same name as my Logic app. So that'll basically go and create an access policy with the name of the Logic app under the RBAC area of this connection. I'm going to use the put operation, and then here again we're using this JSON encode to specify like a JSON message that would be the body for behind the scenes when this API call happens. I'm going to pass in properties with an object called principal, which is of type Active Directory, and then I'm specifying the ID here using the logic app. So if you notice here, this is pointing to the logic app resource from a while ago. It'll have an identity on it, and we'll have that'll be the principal ID for the managed identity for the system assigned ID, and that'll be the tenant ID for Azure AD. So that'll basically create an API call to the Azure Management API behind the scenes, and that'll go and add my logic app's managed identity to be given permission to call this API connection. Okay, so so that basically creates the Azure pieces up to that point. So we've got our logic app deployed, we've got our API connection deployed, and we've got the RBAC between them so the logic app can use the connector. The next thing we have to do is handle the configuration in the logic app in VS Code. So here, this is from my VS Code solution. I've got my connections.json file, and when I leverage the connector inside the designer, it's going to have two properties that I need to think about. So really, we're talking about these bits here. So this would be my service bus connector. You can see here it's pointing out to my API connection in Azure. So you've got parameters that the VS Code injects in for your subscription and stuff. The two key bits are, I need to know this connection runtime URL. So that's going to be the endpoint where the API connection is deployed. Now, that gives me a couple of challenges. So that runtime URL, it's going to change in dev and test. It's going to be two different URLs, so that needs to be parameterized so that it would change by environment. So when you configure that in VS Code, it'll probably go in an app setting, but you want to kind of parameterize it so you can inject it in and change it. So this will be what's in your connections.json. And then you can see the authentication here is currently set to raw. So that'll work great when I run it on my machine. It'll take this value, which will go into the app settings from my local code, and it'll basically have an encoded key that gives me access to the connection, which works great. But that won't work when I'm deploying it to the app in Azure. That key's not going to work to access, so we need to get it working with a managed identity. So these are the bits here that we're going to have to figure out how to change. So you noticed in the previous one, I'd kind of here, I'd referenced that I've got parameters for that connection. So here we're in the parameters.json file, and I've basically created that parameter there, and I'm going to just pull in from an app setting my service bus connector URL. So I've made these changes in my code when I've added the connector, and that'll pull that in from my app settings. So that when I'm in my local settings.json file here, you can see there's a couple of things. So first off, this is my connection to the API hub. So you can see that URL here is really what Logic Apps has behind the scenes to be able to call out to Azure. And that'll call my API connection. So this will be the dev one, but it'll be a different URL in test. You'll notice it's got the API hub here. So it's probable that some of this host name here will change. That'll probably change, and a bunch of stuff off the end. And this is the raw key. So that'll probably change as we go across the different environments. And if I remember right, I think that key gets changed periodically as you're using VS Code. It's kind of doing it in the designer behind the scenes. So that key will not work all the time. So we need to deal with how we're going to handle that. And then the connection string here. Actually, I'm just thinking about whether I actually use that now. I think that might be left over from when I was using the built-in connector. So I'm going to put a question mark for myself to check on that. But the key bits, I've got these through into my local settings.json so I can start changing them. Now, after this, we're back in Terraform here. So this is from my original earlier on slide showing how I configure the Terraform setup. There's a couple of things to notice. Okay, I'm just thinking about that parameter again. I might just check to see whether that gets actually used from there. I think that was, again, the built-in connector. But the key one here is this service bus connector runtime URL. So what I'm going to do here, when I deploy the Terraform for my app, we need to get this runtime URL right for each environment. So if you notice, what I'm doing here is I've got a JSON decode where I've got data, API resource, connectors, after updates. That's that resource where we read, after we deployed the API connection, we made a read on it so we get some properties out of it. And you can see I've got a property there'll be a properties object, and then there'll be connection runtime URL as a parameter that's available. So that it deployment time, Terraform's going to read that runtime URL from the API connection and set it in this app setting in the logic app. So that means when we go back to our local settings.json, when we're running it locally, the designer just configured it so we know what to use. When we run in the cloud, obviously we don't have this local settings.json, but the web app that is the logic app, is the function app, etc. That's going to have a property on the logic app, which will have in the app settings, it'll have this connection string, this runtime URL here. And it's going to have been set at deployment time to point to the connector correct for each environment. So from the perspective of runtime URL, so local dev VS Code sorts that out. When we deploy to dev to Azure, so basically Terraform's configuring that when it deploys your resources and sets it up. So that's good. When we deploy to test, it's going to be exactly the same, and that's good as well. So that means we've configured runtime URL for each environment as appropriate. Now, the next thing we've got to think about is how do we deploy the code. So now we know we've got our logic app deployed in each environment. We've got the things like the runtime URL sorted. We've now just got to deal with that challenge about the connections.json. So here's an example from my VS Code solution. So you can see I've got a folder with my tests, a folder with my Terraform, a folder with my logic app code here, and then I've got this deployment folder where I've put some custom scripts in. So one of the things that, going back to my conversation from Integrate, one of the things that we do that's slightly different, instead of deploying from VS Code where we were having that issue that I need to check on, we're actually just deploying by just running this PowerShell here. So what that PowerShell does is it basically creates a deployment package. Puts the workflows in it, and then it'll basically manipulate the connections.json, and it'll basically change it from being the raw to being the managed identity. So really, what this is doing is it calls these two scripts, and it basically just kind of handles all that. So just to show you, we've put that in GitHub here. So here's the script. You can see, but all you have to do is here in this bit, so it's hard for me to highlight this actually. So the line 20 to 22, you just put your resource group name, your solution name, and your logic app name, and then it'll basically go down and further down. It's down here, line 50 and onwards. It's really just copying stuff into that directory, and then we call that convert managed connections on line 57, which is the bit that converts the managed identity from raw to managed identity. Then we just delete a bunch of stuff out the folder down here that we don't need, and then that gets the zip file ready. So we then have a zip file that we can deploy to Azure. And then if we look down on line 101, so we're using publish AZ web app, which will call out to Azure, and it'll push that zip file up to Azure to be able to do the deployment. And then I've got an option further down line 106 where I can make it run the local tests if I want to kind of do any tests against the app deployed in Azure. So really this script, you just run it. If we go back a second, you can have a little bit of a look here at what these are doing. So it's really just formatting JSON file in here, and converting. So if you see line 126, we're going over those managed API connections, and here we're looking for anything that's of type raw. We change it to managed identity, and then here we're getting rid of the parameters for scheme and parameter. So I think when I spoke to Wagner about this, one of the problems is we couldn't just do a find and replace from raw to managed identity because these properties here were invalid. So this just tweaks that JSON slightly, and then we save it back out to disk. And that's pretty much all that one does. And then this local helpers here, I think it just has a couple of functions that are handy for bits and pieces. Okay, so the link there, that tiny URL goes to the same link above, if just thinking it might be easier for people to get in the video. But basically what we do when we deploy locally is I just run that PowerShell script, and I give it a parameter that says run the tests as well or not, and that's how we do our deployment. So you would use, you need to be logged in on Azure PowerShell to run that script, but otherwise we just run it and it's dead easy. And it handles all those more advanced connection configuration stuff. So what about DevOps pipelines? And so I can deploy from my local machine, but when I run it in a pipeline, you can see here, so here's my pipeline with a bunch of stages. So we've got build and package, which kind of creates a zip file, and it checks the code, compiles and stuff. And then deploy, what we're doing here is we're installing Terraform, and then we're doing Terraform init, validate, release, plan, etc. So this bit here is where it'll run my Terraform solution. That'll go and sort of deploy all that, it'll deploy that logic app, it'll deploy the API connection, it'll do all of the RBAC permissions, and from my perspective, these pipelines for every logic app solution, we just have the same structure and the same pipeline, so that if I add a new connector to it, there's no changes to the pipeline. The Terraform that I run in dev just gets run in test and in the pipeline instead of off my local machine. And then the logic app code deployment is this function here where we're doing the function app deploy task. That'll copy the code into the logic app, and then it's up and running. Now, the only thing that's really significantly different from the demo we did at Integrate, we do in the pipeline, if you notice, this is the build and package area that's up here. So what we're doing is a .NET Restore, .NET Build on the solution. Here I'm running that that file, so this updates the connections.json to use managed identity, and I'm just I don't know if I can, I'll maybe put in the chat the full name of the PowerShell script, but basically it's just running the PowerShell script from the previous thing. So it'll be this one here. It runs this script to convert it to managed identity, and then later on, it's it kind of creates the zip file down here. Then it'll jump into the deploy stage and the test stage and stuff. But this just gives us a clean zip file where it's got everything the logic app needs in it, but we've just tweaked that connections.json to use managed identity instead of raw, and that'll deploy quite nicely. So you might get a couple of occasional errors. This is one of the errors that I got where it said the principal ID. So where is it? Principal ID is immutable. So there was a couple of times I had an issue where I think, if I remember right, I deleted my logic app and my my API connection I hadn't deleted, so I was sorting out a couple of other issues. I thought I'd just put this one in the video just in case somebody comes across it. So what I'd done, I deleted my logic app, I'd left my API connection, I rebuilt my logic app, but the permission on the API connections already been configured with the same name. So when I build my new logic app with the same name, the managed identity is going to be different. So the problem I get then is there's already an access control permission for the same name, but you can't change the ID on it. So here, when I got this, I just simply deleted my API connection and recreated it. I probably could have deleted the access policy that was set up. Maybe that would have given me another way to do that. But that, if you come across that error, that's kind of how to handle that quite easily. You'd only really get it if you sort of manually deleted your logic app, but not your connector or your permission. So hopefully this video's, I know it's a little bit of a lower level technical video talking about that DevOps process. So hopefully it gives you a flavor of how we did stuff. As I say, the GitHub has those scripts in if anybody needs to check on them. There's a bunch of other stuff in this. This is my code snippets repo if anybody wants to pinch other stuff out of it. Hopefully this gives people a bit of an idea of how you can handle those more complicated scenarios in a DevOps pipeline for API connections. Feel free to reach out if anybody's having challenges with this. We can talk a bit more about how we've done this for other connectors. If anybody feels like this video is a little bit too complicated and has questions about it, I can maybe do a follow-up to simplify stuff down a bit. I know I've got a couple of takeaways to check a couple of things as well. As I say, I think looking at that earlier slide, I think the key vault connection string was, the key vault connection string for Service Bus was from when I had the built-in connector, if I remember right, and I moved to the API connector, so that you kind of ignore that at this point. But hopefully that's useful. Feel free to comment any questions and I'll do a follow-up if we need to. Thank you. Have a great week, everybody.